One of the arguments from evil that I like the most is the argument from teleological evil, which I first came across in Felipe Leon and Josh Rasmussen's dialogue. Is God the best explanation of things? And that's a really great book. I would highly recommend that. But there's kind of a similar argument from Quentin Smith, the argument from evil natural laws, like, for instance, laws about predation. So it's just a natural law that animals must savagely kill and devour each other in order to survive. Smith's argument is like, if there are evil natural laws like that, then God doesn't exist. Leon's argument is a little different. It's just about the existence of natural systems who, like, in virtue of their design plan, like when they're acting in accordance with their natural purposes, they produce suffering. And more often than not, suffering to non-moral, non-rational agents. So it's one thing if, there's natural evil like an earthquake or something, and it's just kind of a byproduct of the earthquake or the tsunami that people and animals will suffer. Okay. But there are other forms of natural evil, like teleological evil, where there are these like natural systems that are aimed at producing suffering. Like an earthquake doesn't have a purpose, but like the North American short-tailed shrew, it like secretes this venom so it paralyzes its prey, and then it grazes on its prey for days. It eats it alive. And that's not like a perversion of how it's supposed to work. It's not a misuse of its faculties. That's the design plan. It's behaving exactly the way it's supposed to. So yeah, I mean, if anything, that seems like the product of malevolent design. It's not like poor design. It's very efficient design. It's efficient at producing suffering for, non-rational, non-moral agents. So yeah, it just seems like a pretty crazy inference to like look at that and then think, oh yeah, I bet an unsurpassably great being of perfect love designed this particular, natural system, or is ultimately responsible for it. Again, like, moral evil seems easier to explain than this. Other kinds of natural evil seem easier to explain than this. But like this seems like a particularly difficult kind of natural evil.
Yeah, I think, the teleological argument from evil, I do think is pretty challenging. I remember one time I saw a box of giant scorpion, like carcasses or whatever it's called, and or exoskeleton or whatever the technical term is, and I was like, I don't know, I just started thinking, like, why would God? I mean, I accept evolution, so yeah, there's an evolutionary process, but assuming God, has instantiated the laws and that led to that process, like, why would that be a part of creation, something like that? And it was definitely like, yeah, it seems like just like maybe it's not the most difficult to explain and always in terms of like the suffering produced, although it can be, but it's just in terms of just the oddity of it, like, why would that be a part of creation? Like,
yeah,
I do think that it definitely sticks out, and it's not addressed usually. Like, a lot of times in like debates or the literature, it's more just like focusing on like evil and or suffering in the abstract, or like particular example of horrendous suffering, but this argument isn't usually addressed as much, it seems. And obviously it's somewhat more recent in how it's been focused on. And yeah, I definitely recommend Josh Rasmussen and Felipe Leon's dialogue book. I think it's the best philosophy of religion book that I've read. It's like, if there's one that I could tell people to read, that's the one I would recommend.
Yeah, I think I would agree, actually, because it seems like it has something for everyone at pretty much every level of the discussion. Like, if you're just getting introduced to it, or even if you've been around the block, like, it still seems like it has the most mass appeal, I would say. But yeah, I mean, I really like that book a lot. But yeah,
And I think both of them are. Yeah, I think both representatives are also really strong on each their side too.
Yeah, definitely. There was something else I wanted to say about teleological evil. Oh yeah, it's I think, I can't remember exactly what you said a moment ago. I think about it. You said it doesn't represent like the majority of evil or something along those lines.
Well, I was saying maybe like example wouldn't necessarily of teleological evil or suffering or whatever you want to call it, wouldn't necessarily be like the most horrendous in every case. Like, somebody could say, oh, well, who cares? There's a scorpion. Like, some people's reaction might be like, why is that a big deal? And it's like, well, maybe that's not as emotionally difficult as like, some violent tragedy that occurred, but maybe like the violent tragedy maybe could be explained by free will, and maybe that's like a sufficient explanation, even though obviously it may not be a total explanation. But like the scorpion, just it seems like the scorpion could have just not had a poisonous stinger. Like I don't like it's
Yeah.
it's just more difficult. It just sticks out as more like gratuitous in my, or harder to account for with the traditional type answers.
Well, you
Especially
see,
because a scorpion's not like a moral agent. It's just like I mean, I don't know what it thinks or if it thinks. But yeah, go ahead.
well, you see, you have to distinguish between the intellectual problem of evil and the
Yeah.
emotional problem of evil.
Yeah, I
No,
just want to focus on the emotional one.
that's the one I like to focus on too. No,
I
but
mean,
like,
that's your problem. I mean, you're just bringing all your emotions to the table. I mean,
I think that it actually does account for some of the more horrendous evils and like a pretty shocking amount of it, because predation would fall under this category of
yeah,
teleological evil. So I think like predation is the best example of teleological evil. And that does account for, you know, quite a bit of suffering, quite a bit of
yeah,
animal
yeah. I
suffering.
can't. I
Pretty
just mean
horrendous
even setting it aside, it's like say there's just some scorpion and it never stings anybody. It's still
suffering.
odd that there is like, why did God make something like that? It's
Yeah,
still a
the
question
appearance
that.
of malevolent design is pretty weird, for sure. But it also just, yeah, I mean, I think that the whole issue of predation is like one of the starker examples of like, you know, I think that is really strong evidence against the idea that there's this perfectly loving being who's ultimately responsible for the natural order. But I think, you know, in part because it obviously didn't have to be this way. Like creatures could have been scavengers, they could have been herbivores, they could have absorbed energy from the sun. There's absolutely no reason, or it seems to me there's no reason that it had to be the case that animals had to savagely kill and devour each other just to feed themselves and their children. Like, you know, we've been like put in this biological order where it's like animals are sort of pitted against each other in this fight to the death, basically. And it's like, oh yeah, and this was produced by a perfectly loving being. Like what? I personally don't think it was. But for me, it is actually pretty. I mean, we were just joking earlier, but it is kind of emotionally compelling because, you know, like Quentin Smith opens up his paper about evil natural laws with a camping trip where he heard an animal, you know, being killed and eaten by another animal, and it like, you know, it really affected him. Um, but you know, as I was saying at the beginning, I think I'd just be an agnostic if it weren't for arguments from evil. And I've been getting more interested in kind of fringe interpretations of Christianity that are kind of uniquely capable of handling most of my objections, with the exception of arguments from evil. Those fringe interpretations being a universalist, by the way. But you know, I remember I was feeling kind of agnostic this day. It was like a week or two ago, and I was taking a walk at night, and then I heard some animal, you know, being killed and eaten by some other animal, and I was like, "Oh yeah, God doesn't exist." I forgot for a second. But yeah, just the whole issue of teleological evil and predation in particular, the fact that it's in virtue of the way things are supposed to work. It just seems very, very improbable to me that you know, a perfectly loving and perfectly good being would design things this way, as opposed to something like just indifference, um, or uh, or some kind of like very limited force. You know, something that has a limited capacity, or you know, it can't bring about. It doesn't have the kind of power that God is said to have. Yeah, because
Yeah,
if things are indifferent, then of course you'd expect. Why? I mean, why wouldn't you expect there to be some malevolent appearing design in nature? Like, yeah, there'd be some natural systems aimed towards producing pleasure, some aimed at producing suffering. I mean, on indifference, it's just not surprising, but on theism, it seems very, very surprising.
yeah. Yeah, and yeah. So then, looking at the two theodicies I wanted to focus on. So I'll just start with the soul building one because it's not the one that I defend, but that's the one that gets defended a lot. So I guess a soul building type defender might respond to this by saying, like Cameron Bertuzzi and like Trent Doherty, wrote his book defending this type of view that like, well, animals can grow in virtue as well, and maybe predation allows them to do that, and then maybe we can grow in virtue from being having to deal with predators and such. So they would kind of like try to weave it into that. And I'll let you respond, of course, but I guess I feel like that's like somewhat consistent. I mean, it's a consistent response. I guess I struggle to find it very satisfying because it seems like, well, I just have a lot of issues with the soul building too, that it's not that it's illogical or inconsistent. I just feel like it doesn't explain the data with that great. But yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, soul building seems well suited to explain some evil. And I'm kind of partial to the view that the causal history of things like really matters. Like, I don't know if it's like an irrational view or not, but it makes sense to me that like, oh, if God just created us in some kind of final form, and like just with all the, I don't know, memories or something like that, just, I don't know, something about that would seem very phony to me. Like I just wouldn't, even if I can't really articulate it, I have this intuition that the causal history of organisms actually matters, or the causal history of conscious beings. So I do think that soul building, as opposed to what some people have proposed, like, well, why couldn't God just create us in this, whatever the end product is going to be through all this soul building, why couldn't God just create us like that? And I think that, yeah, I think in some cases of suffering, I think soul building is kind of well suited to answer it, but I have no idea how it could even apply to teleological evil. Like, even given what you just said, it just doesn't ring true to me. It's just it seems so hollow. It's like, I mean, I think that all theodicies are kind of obvious failures. And I mean, obviously that's why I'm an atheist, but I think that like a lot of them just feel like they're just trying to find a way to justify the view. Like I kind of wonder when I look at a lot of theodicies, I'm like, does anyone actually think this is the way the world is though? Like, are they just trying to respond? Are they just trying to find a way to support their view?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's what atheists do with morality and consciousness and that. Yeah, with soul building, I mean, just to go through the issues I have with it just real quick, and obviously this is just a quick summary, but it just seems like God could create people like himself with those virtues without having them have to go through the process, or like maybe there would need to be some kind of process, but like I would think it could be more benevolent, like Catholics, believe in purgatory, and I like to think of purgatory as like place of like growth, and like it just seems like it could be a more controlled environment. Like we don't need, like, even if some teleological evils could contribute to growing in virtue and such, is certainly possible. And maybe animals can grow in virtue too, although I'm kind of skeptical of that. But like, let's just grant all of that. It still seems like there are other ways to do it that don't require teleological evil. It might take longer. I mean, maybe, but that's okay. Like it could take longer. But it doesn't mean it's hard to think that like the teleological evil is like really essential to the process. Like, why does the scorpion need a stinger in order for there to be soul building? And like, it's really hard for me to see like the plausible contribution. Somebody could come up with a way, but, and especially when you think about like the distribution, it's like not everybody's even exposed to the same like teleological evils across the globe and such. If it was so essential, it just seems like it's a real scatter shot. Like there are animals that like most people will never encounter, but if you did, they cause horrific pain and suffering. And like, it's just hard for me to see how like that's integral to soul building. Not to say like one couldn't find a way, but that's kind of the difficulties that I have.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that non-moral agents, it just seems kind of obvious they can't enjoy any kind of soul building. I mean, like, it doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, some people have kind of suggested, yeah, like, oh, there's this animal heaven, and then, there's kind of like the soul building process continues after death or something. And it's like, I mean, that leads to further questions, which I know you're not like defending that now, so I won't pursue them, but it raises a lot of interesting questions when people, try to, I think, like stretch soul building kind of past its like where it makes any sense to apply it. But yeah, I don't see how soul building could possibly help with hundreds of millions of years of unnecessary animal predation.
Yeah, and I mean, I like the animal afterlife view. I mean, that's the view that I favor, but it's like, well, it still doesn't, I mean, is there going to be lots of teleological evils in the animal afterlife? Like, it doesn't seem like that's the narrative. Like that, I don't see why that would be plausible, or like, it just re-raises the same question again. Like, it's just hard to see how I mean, I guess somebody could come up with a story, kind of like John Hick, who's kind of credited with like the modern, chief defender of soul building. I guess his view extended to like there's lots of afterlife. So I guess somebody could say like it's really essential that somebody experiences this type of predator and that they will eventually. I just find that to be like really implausible. Like why does the suffering have to come in that way? And it just seems like a lot of suffering doesn't result in growth in virtue anyways. Like I don't see like why getting stung by a scorpion necessarily makes somebody a better person. And like,
Right.
and even if it does, like there wasn't another way, like it just seems really forced. And like, yeah, so it's not like I want to charge the defender of this view with like incoherence. It just seems like it doesn't map onto the data very, like it just seems really stretched to me to make it work for everything.
Yeah, I mean, you're putting it too nicely, honestly. Like, yeah, I mean, like the idea that there's some kind of soul building involved when the North American short-tailed shrew is grazing on its victim. Like, these are just two creatures that are just like, probably not very complex creatures. They're just driven mostly by instinct, and yeah, they're just doing what they're designed to do. They're just, they're just causing suffering to each other because that's exactly how they were designed. That's how it was set up. There's no perversion going on. There's no like misuse of some kind of faculty. There's like, there's nothing like that happening in the cases of teleological evil.
Yeah. So I want to present my theodicy, which of course I have a longer video on and I've defended it some, and I'm not saying it's like a knockdown response, but I do think it's plausible to my mind though, and I recognize people's thoughts and intuitions can differ, and there are other responses out there and such. But so I call it the perfect will theodicy, and I know you're at least somewhat familiar with it, and I'll just explain it in short and then explain how I would try to use it to respond to teleological evil. So the idea is that in creating, there's a kind of causal system or causal nexus that we might, call laws of physics or nature. It doesn't really matter what words we use, but any universe that God creates that's going to be causally regular, I'm going to argue has to be interconnected in some sense with this causal system. And if this causal system was fully conform to God's intellect and will, and by that I just mean like God's innermost desires and intentions you would have for creation, then, so again, the system was fully conformed to God's intellect and will, we would get a universe like Christians imagine, like the new heavens and new earth. There's no suffering, everybody's in a harmonious, loving relation with God, and that would be a great world, but it would also be a world where everybody's necessarily in a loving relation with God, because it's just the ideal reality. But I argued that it's unjust for God to force people into that kind of relation. They need a chance to be able to at least have some kind of opportunity to choose to enter that relation with God or not. So he creates the universe with a partially conformed causal system. So a system that's partially conformed to his intellect and will, but then you get a universe where the causal system doesn't fully align with God's intellect and will. So you get a system of creation, of evolution and such, but it's one that is only, so the analogy I kind of like to use, it'd be like a computer that has viruses, like it needs to be debugged, and it's not because there's like literal things like anti-God viruses. It's just like the system just doesn't fully match God's intentions. And again, that's to respect the free will of at least rational creatures. And then the way that extends to animals and teleological evils, again, is because the laws are what I'm imagining is what drives the evolutionary system. But if this system of laws is only partially conformed to God's intentions, then it's only going to partially match his overall creative intentions, and then that's going to inadvertently lead to these teleological evils and such. So obviously there's more that can be addressed, and there are a number of objections that can be raised, but so what are your thoughts on that? I know you probably have a lot of objections, but go ahead.
I mean, I have objections to the perfect will theodicy in general, but I've never even thought about trying to apply it to teleological evil. I mean, yeah, I guess if you can justify the overall point about you can't create a world that's perfectly in line with God's will, if you can justify that overall point, then you could expect things that would be evidence against theism because, if it's something like malevolent design or something, well, okay. I mean, if you've already explained why you think it has to be the case that, we start off in a world that doesn't perfectly line up with God's will, then okay, that might make sense. But I think there are kind of like deeper problems with the theodicy that, I mean, like I wouldn't. I literally did not think about it until just now of like trying to apply the perfect will theodicy um, to teleological evil.
So I win.
But
Time to go home.
well, I do have some. I mean, I guess I was thinking we'd save theodicies more for the end, but it makes more sense to do it this way of like.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. I mean, we could save. I mean, we could, if you want to go through some other problems and then and save.
No,
like,
no, we
the
can do
general
it. This is a better way to do it.
Okay, go ahead.
It just feels weird to like launch into my general problem with perfect will theodicy.
I understand. You're a little scared, but
so as I understand it, it's like it would be immoral for God to create us in a way where we just like naturally love him for the same way it would be wrong to give someone a love potion. Like it's not really this like freely chosen thing. It's more like you were just, I mean, you used a word a second ago, force people into a relationship with God. I'll try not to get too hung up on this, but I like am tempted to just quibble with the word force because typically I feel like that means someone wants to do one thing and you make them do another thing. But if you're creating them with a will such that they just want to love you and they just find a relationship with you irresistible, that's not really what force means. It's like a different kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, and it tends to be a lot of the pushback I get for people who have engaged with the theodicy the most will be an intuition about free will, and if somebody's attracted to compatibilism, or what are the moral parameters around like a forced relation. That usually is where they end up pushing back. So I can understand that. Yeah, I mean, I do think it seems plausible, at least, that if God created everybody and they never had an opportunity to not fully love God, that does strike me as that could be problematic. Like, I mean, I get what you're saying. Like, it's or at least what it sounds like you're saying is like they would need to kind of not be in that situation and then be forced to do it. But if they're already created in it, then it wasn't really forced. But I don't know. My intuition, though, is that somebody needs to like start out at like a neutral, or at least somewhat neutral ground, and then decide if they want to go into a deeper relation with God or not. But obviously, that's an intuition that I have that you may not share.
Yeah, I mean, and I am a compatibilist, but I mean, I'm willing to just sort of grant. I want to grant some of the like starting points for the theodicy because I think there are other problems with it that are deeper. So I feel like God has already done the thing that you're saying he wouldn't have done. So I was asking if you were an annihilationist earlier, and I'm not sure. Did you say that you seemed kind of uncertain about it?
Well, I mean, I'm fine with annihilationism in terms of like, I think it makes sense if somebody, like, I'm a hopeful universalist. I do hope everybody is saved, but I don't know if that will be the case. So I don't think God is going to torture somebody or allow somebody to be, tortured for all eternity. But what like the nature of the eternal separation would be, I don't know. It could be that they're annihilated, or it could be they go to some kind of like sleep type state. Like if you've seen the movie, like What Dreams May Come, like Robin Williams kind of finds his wife in this like comatose type state, and that's kind of the view. Like I have a video defending that kind of view speculatively, or it could be something like C.S. Lewis' Great Divorce, where people are like wondering in this like shadowy type realm. Like I don't know. I don't think God's going to torture somebody for all eternity, but the nature of hell, I don't know what that would be. But yeah, hopefully that makes sense.
I love that phrase, hopeful universalist. Like, yeah, I'm a hopeful lottery winner. Oh, that's nice. You're a hopeful universalist. I mean, I guess it does signal one useful thing, which is like you're not one of these freaks or psychos who like wants there to be eternal conscious torment, who's like actively rooting for it. So that's at least nice. But that phrase does, other than that, I mean, it does signal that one useful thing. But other than that, that phrase, hopeful universalist, always kind of gets under my skin. It's like, are you a universalist or not? Just say yes or no. Like, It's not
Well,
just you, it's a really common term.
well, it's because, well, I think there is some grounds for it, though. I mean, it's pretty rich coming from a compatibilist. No, I'm kidding. No, like, but I mean, it's saying like, yeah, we think it's plausible everybody will be saved, but we can't say like definitively. I just don't know. It could be that like it is the like given the nature of free will, and like there are people who will absolutely reject relation with God, and there's nothing God could do if He's not going to force, or however you want to put it, He's not going to make them go to heaven to enter a relation with Him. Then like seems like eternal separation is then the result, and like that does seem reasonably plausible to my mind.
I mean, not to go down this rabbit hole, but like I think the standard response at this point is like, well, no rational person who's aware of the relevant facts would freely choose to not be in a relationship with God once they're aware of the relevant pieces of information they might not be aware of now, but once they like a rational creature in full possession of their faculties would not freely choose to reject a relationship with God eternally. Like it's impossible for someone to be eternally separated from God is like the standard response at this point. But we don't have to start arguing about universal.
Well, sorry. And I guess to respond to that, like I think it is. I think if somebody was actively like willing their misery, that does seem implausible to me. But the idea of like actively rejecting a relation with God simpliciter, like that doesn't seem that implausible to me. I mean, obviously, if they fully understood the ramifications, they might not, but it seems like that's kind of part of the moral question, is whether or not they're willing to enter into a relation with God, and then they that does entail these other benefits. But yeah, I mean that'll be a different
That's
debate.
actually
But I mean,
that's a good in back to the point about the perfect will theodicy, actually, because my claim is that God has already done the thing that you're saying he can't do. Because on the view that you just outlined of like, there's separation from God, it's eternal, probably, like whether that means annihilation or something like the Great Divorce or whatever. The point is there's eternal separation from God, and that's bad. Okay, and like so the thing that you're outlining here is basically God didn't create a strong desire in us to be in a relationship with God, but He created two options, one of which is a relationship with God. The other option is something that we have a strong desire to avoid, which is just a roundabout way of doing the same thing. Like, so he's basically issuing this death threat where you're going to be annihilated if you don't enter into a relationship with God. And I mean, like, our fear of death is a pretty common, constant thing throughout human history, like in literature and art. And it's like, we're terribly afraid of death. So even in the best case scenario on your view, where we're annihilated, as opposed to, something worse, God created us with this fear of death and this fear of being tortured and this, fear of, and all these like things that we would desire to avoid if we knew about them. No one wants to go to hell for an eternity. And most people, I think, if they're being honest, don't want to die. And I'm just saying, the thing I just said is in reference to a bunch of people on Twitter who were saying that they would rather not have like an eternal afterlife of bliss or something, which I think is cope. But anyway,
right, sorry, to clarify, you're saying that their response is a cope, or you're saying
people saying like, oh, I wouldn't want to have an eternal afterlife of bliss. It's like, as opposed to dying, like you'd rather die than have eternal life of an eternal life of a generally positive character. Like that's
right. I do sympathize with a lot of arguments and responses atheists, agnostics give, but yeah, I've never understood this, like, well, heaven would get boring, or it's like, well, what point would like eternal bliss get boring? I don't like,
it would feel good. It would be nice. I mean, like, yeah, I can picture versions of the afterlife that would suck. Like, I wouldn't want to be one of those angels that flies around God's head saying, holy, holy, holy for all eternity. That would be awful. But I mean, the thing, like, just because there's this failure of any kind of compelling description of heaven from certain quarters, it doesn't, I mean, like, that doesn't mean that any kind of version of heaven just like would get boring. Or I mean, again, another discussion. Maybe we should have another talk about like soteriology and the afterlife and stuff. But just to bring it back around, it seems like you're saying God wouldn't create us with a desire to be in a relationship with Him, but instead what He has done is create the situation where there are two options. One of them is a relationship with him, and the alternative is something that we are deathly afraid of. So it seems like he is actually doing this thing that you said he wouldn't do, of like kind of forcing people or coercing people into a relationship with him. It's just it's like one step removed from the more direct way. And secondly, I mean, this is in addition to that point, Christians claim to feel that their relationship with God is irresistible. They use language explicitly like they're a slave to Christ. And, they're not upset about it. And that's kind of why I think there wouldn't be anything wrong with God creating us with a desire to be in a relationship with him in the first place. Because it's like we would just be doing what we wanted to do. We'd be happy about it. God would be happy about it, and it would be fine. And like, again, this already appears to be the situation. Like, God is supposed to be irresistible, and some Christians claim to find God irresistible. And, I mean, that seems better to me than, issuing threats. But either way, I mean, by your definition of coercive, both of those options are coercive. But I mean, where I would disagree is I actually don't think it would be coercive just to create beings to want to be in a relationship with God.
Okay. So, yeah, so I do think people do have a natural desire for what's good, whatever that, like, and I'll just define that as like something fulfilling. So like eating, sleeping, whatever fulfills somebody is what I'm calling good. And I do think being in relation with God is the ultimate good thing. But I do think there is like personal component, like I guess I'm thinking of an analogy, kind of like Beauty and the Beast or something, where it's like there's a component of like, well, this aspect is good, but you have to like accept the person first, type of thing. And somebody can fill out however they want. But the idea is like, I think that, yeah, we do have a natural desire for what's good, and that is by extension God. But I do think it is important that people have a freedom in how they choose to cultivate their specific personal relation with God. And I do know, obviously, yeah, there are some Christians who say it's irresistible. I don't have that view. I don't think it's irresistible. I think it's attractive, but I think it's a cultivated attraction. And I think God works. So I really like a synergistic view of grace, that God is working with somebody's will, but they are responding to him in a libertarian free will kind of sense to cultivate that relation. And so I don't, and our fear of death and such is a rationally based fear. So in that sense, it is from God. But to me, like, if the axiom is granted that God, it would be wrong for God to force or start somebody in the relation with him, or however one wants to cash that out. If that's wrong, it seems to me like the two alternatives would be somebody is ultimately in relation with God or they're not. Like it seems like it would be, to my mind, like a metaphysical necessity that it would be in relation with God for all eternity by the end, at least, or not. And then whatever that not is would rationally be a bad thing, but it's still, to my mind, morally important that somebody has that choice. But I recognize that obviously you can push back on that.
I think it's interesting though that you think it is resistible. I mean, I think if God existed, then he would be irresistible if you had like a full enough understanding of God.
Oh yeah, I agree.
Like,
Yeah, if you beheld his essence, then yeah, it would be. But that to me would be coercive if God just did that immediately. And the thing is, like, that actually has been in the tradition though at times. So it's not like something I just made up. Like that actually goes back. At least there were some like medieval thoughts on that and such. So.
I mean, that's why I was saying that eternal separation as a result of a free choice just doesn't make any sense to me. Like, like you just granted, I think that if God was fully revealed to someone, then it would be irresistible. So that's what I was trying to say earlier. It's like if someone actually did kind of have a full enough understanding of God, then they wouldn't see it like, Christopher Hitchens saying that, he's like a big brother or something. That's just, if it's any sort of negative thing whatsoever, then it's actually not this, unsurpassably great being of perfect love.
But there
like,
isn't different. Or sorry, you want to finish?
No, I was just saying that, like, if you're thinking that it would make sense to, I wouldn't want this God to exist, then it's not really an unsurpassably great being of perfect love. And I'm saying if there is such a being and they were to reveal themselves to you enough that you kind of understood however imperfectly, like what was actually going on, then you would not choose to be separated from that being.
Right. So I think that there's a distinction, though, in my mind between God's essence, and I mean, obviously, in my mind, there's not a metaphysical distinction between like God's attributes, but because he's just one, in my view, one undivided substance. But there is a epistemic, I guess, distinction on our part between a relation with the personhood of God and a beholding of the good things that beholding God's essence would bestow. So somebody who beholds God would be so like filled with pleasure and bliss and such, then yeah, they wouldn't turn away. But that doesn't mean that that person actually like cares about God as a personal being. Now, I'm not at all implying that there are people who are like, although there may be, but people like actively, willfully hating God. But I think if somebody is an immoral person and, being like a just and charitable person or seeking after justice and charity is also an extension of God's character, then I think being immoral is kind of inchoate or implicit way of severing one's relation with God. So I just see all these things as epistemically distinct, but still interrelated. So like, yeah, if somebody beholds God's essence, they're going to be like a mosquito or whatever attracted towards one of those, blue lights, but it doesn't mean they actually care about God. So I think you need to, in my view, somebody needs to care about God before God blesses them with his fullness of being. But what do you think about that?
I guess I'm just not totally grasping that distinction about how you could find God irresistible but not really care about God, like on a personal level. It seems like what I was imagining was God's like revealing himself to you, and then as a direct consequence of that revelation, yeah, you're attracted to God. But it's not like in some shallow sense. Like it's because of your understanding of what God actually is. Like I thought that's what would be going on in that scenario.
Well, I guess like going back to like the Beauty and the Beast analogy, and I assume you're somewhat familiar with the
I've
story,
actually
but
never seen that movie.
oh, that's why you don't get it.
That's why it's not clicking for me.
You just have terrible taste. No, but like okay, so I mean, at the beginning of the story, though, there's like this arrogant prince and this like hag, or maybe that's a rude word, but some older, but like that's how it's presented in the story. She's like an older like beggar comes to the castle and wants him to give her something or take a flower or something. Anyways, he like turns her away, and then she turns into this beautiful like enchantress, and then she curses him. But that's not the point I'm focusing on. The point is, though, he like repents, like, oh, I didn't know you were so beautiful. But it's like, well, really, if he was a decent person, he would have been charitable to her anyways. So I'm saying the person who, yes, they might behold God's essence and want to be in communion with him because they see he's so beautiful and such, but they need to be a charitable person first and want to be like God in his character and actually want to care for not just God, but for just to be a loving person first before they are before they're enjoying like the beauty and splendor and such. So that's kind of the epistemic distinction that I make.
Okay. Do you mind if I like if I zoom out for a second and just to kind of rehash like where we're at, I think right now. I think that okay, so we were talking about teleological evil. We were trying to apply the perfect will theodicy to teleological evil, and I was saying that prima facie it seems like if you're just making this general assertion that like we kind of have to have a world that is not in line with God's will, like in other words, the world would kind of like look the opposite of how we would ordinarily expect it to look on theism. Like, okay, yeah, if you could make that work, then I suppose that would, yeah, prima facie, it seems like that would follow. So then I wanted to take a look at the perfect will theodicy to see if it actually can justify that sort of claim. And I'm saying that I don't think it can. Like, I think it. So if the perfect will theodicy fails, then it can't really be applied to teleological evil. And I'm saying I think it does fail because the theodicy starts out with saying, well, God can't do X. And what I'm saying is, I think God has done X, and he's also done Y, which is basically equivalent to X. So I think that it just kind of fails on those terms.
Right. So yeah, I think that's kind of where we're at, and then yeah, I mean, I have a differing intuition on that, but yeah. So I think for now that might be where our impasse is, but um, so what we could do is, if you want to present, or I mean, if you want to critique this theodicy more or make more points, that's fine. Or if you
It
want to
might be
bring
more
another,
fruitful to like come back to it later after.
sure, yeah, we can always discuss it more again in the future because there's other rabbit holes and such. But so we've been going close to an hour, and I do want to address a few questions, but I also want to let you present at least one more problem of evil if you have one that you want to present. I know some of them are kind of similar, but if you want to present one that's maybe a little bit different, and we could also look at that. But whatever you want to do is.
Yeah, okay. So I just wanted to say that I view these arguments, so like the teleological argument from evil, argument from evolutionary animal suffering, which is similar but distinct. Also, Humean arguments from pain and pleasure, like Paul Draper's famous paper from 1989. Arguments from particular horrendous evils. Like I don't really view these in like a deductive form or like in a logical problem of evil sort of approach, like where we're trying to find a contradiction between the proposition God exists and evil exists. Like I don't know if there's an outright logical contradiction between God exists and between certain things that are like undeniably true, I guess, about our world. I tend to just approach things in like a more cumulative case fashion, like an inference to the best explanation kind of abductive approach, or some kind of inductive approach. So the way that people tend to approach is like Richard Swinburne or Paul Draper, they use this explicitly Bayesian approach. And I'm not really married to that. For me, it's just about asking whether the world looks like we would expect it to. Like if God exists, if there's a perfectly loving being at the foundation of reality that's ultimately responsible for the character of the world, is this what you would expect the world to look like? And for me, the answer is no. Like I can point to some facts and I can say, I don't think these facts would be facts if that kind of God existed. So, whether or not there are like legitimate criticisms of the Bayesian approach, for me, that thing that I just outlined is much broader than, specifically the Bayesian approach. But the other argument that is sort of related to the previous one, but again, it's still kind of distinct, is evolutionary animal suffering, which just has to do with the sheer amount of seemingly pointless suffering endured by non-rational, non-moral agents over eons of evolutionary history. And we have to keep in mind that this is actually the method by which God brought about his creation. So he could have used special creation. Like he could have done things the way that many Christians actually believe he did. Like a lot of Christians believe in, actually the vast majority of Christians believe in special creation or intelligent design. Most Christians reject theistic evolution. So I think it's just a fact that evolution is true and that intelligent design and special creation are false. So, I mean, that's a separate argument, but I think that it's kind of credulity straining to say that God used this like pitiless process of evolution by natural selection in order to bring things about when he did not have to do that. He could have done things the way that Christians believe he did, instead of the way that he apparently, in fact, did. Like, this is such a bizarre tool for a perfect being to like bring about his creation. Especially, I mean, it's so hard to comprehend the amount of suffering that's taken place in nature, like the suffering endured by wild animals over the last few 100 million years. So yeah, I think when the weight of that really strikes me, it's just like that's when I feel pretty certain that perfect being theism is false.
Yeah, so I look at the argument from evolutionary animal suffering as kind of having a similar structure as the teleological argument, in the sense that there's like something I view as being a product of the natural world, or I would say of like the laws of the natural world. And then, in the one case, it's resulting in these, predatory traits and such. And then in this case, it would just be more broadly about animal suffering and preying upon each other. But I look at them as being kind of interrelated. So I would give the same type of response that we were
Yeah,
discussing.
I think they're distinct. It's that sort of teleological aspect is not essential to the argument that I just said, or that I just stated.
Yeah,
But I think that your theodicy, like, it would basically be the same response.
Yeah, I
From your
think the
perspective.
soul building person would respond similarly as well.
Yeah.
Is what we were at least outlining. Of course, I'm not a huge proponent of that, so I know there are people that may think I didn't steel man it as well as they would like. So I can
I,
invite you onto their channel to
yeah.
debate you.
I mean, I will say that there's this really interesting trend of Christians kind of diminishing the kind of suffering in the world that we see, especially animal suffering. And I think this is maybe what's going on. I think that it's like just a natural tendency for human beings to want to think that they're right and that the people who disagree with them are not just wrong, but obviously wrong. And the problem of evil is a pretty big problem for Christianity. So if you're a Christian and you are subject to this natural human tendency to want to believe that the people who disagree with you are obviously wrong, then you have to think that the problem of evil is just kind of stupid. And you have to think that arguments from evil like obviously fail. And that necessarily involves diminishing the suffering of human beings, the suffering of animals over evolutionary history. So it results in this kind of like moral callousness and this kind of like casual, I don't know how to say it. It's just like this casual callousness about great evil and terrible suffering. And it's genuinely appalling. Like it just kind of repels me from Christianity. But I think that it's just the product of a few normal tendencies for human beings. Like I think what I just outlined is plausible. Like I think that people just need to think that people who disagree with them are obviously wrong. Okay, well, this is a big problem for your view, so that argument is obviously wrong. Well, dismissing that argument as obviously wrong or diminishing it necessarily involves kind of being a bit callous and seemingly like morally inept when it comes to things like animal suffering.
Yeah, well, I think you're just letting your emotions take control of yourself at this point. So, yeah, I mean, I agree. Like, I mean, to me, it's like as I said earlier, like I can sympathize with the Christian who, doesn't have a full response to the problem of evil, but I mean, obviously, like, that's been myself at times, and I'm not saying I have like the answer or whatever. Like, it's a difficult question, but like, especially like some theodicies, I just find so implausible that it's like you can't really like live with thinking that that's really the case. Like, I don't know, like for a while I kind of like was defending this like butterfly effect type response where it's like, well, you don't know that this could lead to this, which isn't like full-blown skeptical theism, but it's, I guess it could be called like kind of like skeptical theism, but I look at it as like a response. But it's just like, I just really don't think that's how things work. Like it makes you think, it kind of leads to like a kind of fatalism where it's like, oh, everything is good, like that tragedy actually is like important. Like it's like it leads to a lot of cognitive dissonance. And like, yeah, so I do think that, well, I don't think like Christians responding like, oh, the problem of evil is weak, like it doesn't necessarily mean they're like a bad person or something, but like I do think it can lead to an unnatural view of the world that it's not like, and it's not really the view that like seems to be conveyed in like the New Testament. Like it seems like the New Testament's treating suffering as a problem, not like, oh, like this isn't a big deal. Like, I mean, I know sometimes Christians will appeal to like the book of Job and such, but that gets a whole other thing. Like the Bible has lots of different perspectives, but that's a whole other topic.
Yeah. I don't mean to say that like Christians are bad people. I'm just saying, especially with like, I don't know, like younger men and stuff, like men who are our age. I've noticed,
like John Buck,
like John Buck, who's, I mean, morally depraved, kind of a retrobate. But no, it's like on Thomas Twitter, especially. I mean, that's like the most depraved cesspool imaginable. But yeah, I've noticed that it seems like a big problem. More so with like some demographics than others, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But yeah, if you want to be kind of like overconfident and cocky about your view as a theist, then I think that pretty naturally leads to a kind of callousness and yeah, kind of like almost like stunting of your moral faculties. This is where I start sounding kind of like an anti-theist. But yeah, I mean, I think it's unfortunate, but It's something I've seen enough times that it like really bothers me, and it's not just from, you know, random Thomists on Twitter. It's also from like William Lane Craig and others. But oh, speaking of William Lane Craig, he actually I've heard him explain skeptical theism with the butterfly effect. Like he talks about the butterfly effect and um, like chaos theory and stuff, and like tries to, it's just like, oh well, you're ignorant of how the causal web all fits together and stuff, and like maybe this thing that seems bad is actually really important, and if you got rid of it, then there would be some kind of evil that's equally bad or worse that would pop up, or there'd be some good that would go away. um, and of course that like directly leads to moral paralysis and skepticism about your moral faculties and ability to judge when things are actually unambiguously bad, and it would be an unambiguous good to get rid of this thing from the world. Like I just think it would be unambiguously good to get rid of child cancer. I think that would just be an unalloyed good. But the butterfly effect, I don't understand how
Especially
someone can walk around like through their life thinking that.
yeah. Well, especially because traditionally, I mean, at least in my view, Christianity's been associated with the more deontic type ethical view, and we're also called to be perfect like God is. And obviously, Christians, we believe God is different than us in some ways, but yeah, it just, to me, it creates this kind of, just creates a lot of cognitive dissonance. But all right, Nicholas says, if some theodicy could work with special creation, doesn't the argument from animal suffering just become an argument for special creation? Why assume God didn't do it that way if we have reason to think he does? And I guess the way I'm interpreting your question, Nicholas, is like saying, like, if animal suffering or argument from evolutionary suffering seems to imply that God would specially create them, should we become a creationist? And I would say,
That's an awesome argument. That's a great Morian shift. Yeah, it's like, hey, this argument actually works, therefore special creation is true. That's awesome.
Well, some creationists I've seen do make that kind of argument. Like, I visited the Creation Museum once, and they seem to be making that as like a primary argument for creationism, or like at least why Christians should embrace. Now, obviously, they will say, they think the science can be interpreted that way. But then, and I'm not an expert on evolutionary biology, but like obviously, there are reasons to favor that perspective.
I didn't know that. I didn't know. I thought it was all scientific arguments from them. I didn't realize that they were saying like, hey, if God did bring about creation through evolution.
No, that was their main spiel too. I mean, they assumed, I think they were talking to a Christian audience, but their primary thing was animal suffering. They're like, well, if God created the revolution, then death preceded the fall. Like that was their. Now the museum
that's kind of a theological argument. I thought they were saying like, this would be such a cruel way for God to bring about his creation.
They might have said that too. Granted, it was a while back, so I don't want to like say this is what they're saying, and I don't want to misrepresent. But I think I have heard creationists have tended, at least seemed like they've tended to suggest that at times. And yeah, I would just say like, yeah, you really don't want to bite a bullet of rejecting scientific consensus to protect your theology. It's better to just try to find a different route than that.
If I could do anything tonight, it's bolster young earth creationism. That's mainly why I'm here. But yeah, no, that's I actually do believe though that if we lived in the young earth creationist world, like the one that Ken Ham thinks we actually do believe in, then I mean there would be a lot more evidence for theism. It would seem like the probability of theism would be raised significantly if young earth creationists were right about the facts on the ground.